As a result of the New Year's Eve storm of December 31st, 2005, a paleobotanical discovery was made within Sugarloaf Ridge State Park on the headwaters of Sonoma Creek. The storm dumped almost 10 inches of rain overnight, causing creeks and rivers to flood their banks in the northern San Francisco Bay Area of Northern California. The discovery provides an important perspective on the forests of the Mayacama Mountains during the late Pleistocene. It also has the potential to help inform our knowledge of the challenges that face us in these times of global climate change. At the time, I was a senior state archaeologist with California State Parks, and I was living in the state residence at Sugarloaf Ridge State Park on the headwaters of Sonoma Creek. Following the storm, I spent weeks and weeks surveying the local parklands of the North Bay, walking the recently swollen creeks and riverbanks. Flooded waterways are destructive. They can cause substantial erosion and property loss. The New Year's Eve storm was no exception. Flood events like this are also revealing. As I surveyed the ravaged creeks and waterways, I found bits and pieces of the area's archaeological record. Previously unknown cultural resources were found and important details were revealed about other sites that were already known. But the one discovery that I made in the days and weeks following the storm had nothing to do with archaeology. This was a Paleo-Floral deposit I discovered on Sonoma Creek, just a short walk from my home. I found the site while wading up Sonoma Creek, examining the exposed creek bank from the creek's perspective. I wanted to see what the storm had exposed. Less than a kilometer from my house, I found numerous specimens of partially carbonized wood eroding from a deeply buried deposit. This Paleo-Floral deposit was at least 90 centimeters thick, and it consisted of a blue clay stratum about 6 meters below the top of the bank on the right side of the creek. It's likely that the deposit of blue clay extends below the current base of the creek bed. The deposit appears to be associated with an area of land subsidence on the slope immediately above the creek. The scar of the slide can be seen extending about 100 meters up the hillside. It's apparent that this is not a recent slide. I suspect it dates to more ancient times. In fact, I believe that it's likely that the slide created the Paleo-Floral deposit at the edge of the creek. Providing the slide was present during the late Pleistocene, its occasional movement could explain the floral remains found in the blue clay at the toe of the slide. The high water event of December 31st, 2005, cut into the creek bank, exposing the layer of blue clay. A few months later, a rain event caused the slide to move, burying the area where I had seen the exposed blue clay. A few years later, another high water event washed away the toe of the slide, making the blue clay layer visible once more. I suspect this interaction between slide and creek is one stretching back into the distant past, quite possibly to the time of the last ice age. Upon discovering the site, I spent the next day or two working on its documentation and collecting a small handful of samples of the Paleo-Floral specimens I could see eroding from the blue clay. I suspected that the blue clay was associated with the Ice Age, but I couldn't confirm it at the time. A few months went by, during which time another big rainstorm occurred. More months passed. Having had more time to consider the potential significance of the site, I decided to return and collect additional specimens of the fossil plant material that I had observed in the exposure. I went back in September of 2006. To my surprise, I found that a landslide had completely buried the blue clay exposure I had seen 9 months earlier. As a result, I wasn't able to access the stratum for further sampling. In 2014, there was another heavy rainfall and a high water event on Sonoma Creek. Not long afterwards, I revisited the Paleo-Floral site to see if the water had cleared the landslide. It had. Seeing this, I seized the opportunity to further sample the site. The vast majority of the specimens I collected from the deposit came from this 2014 sampling. The recent floodwaters had undercut the creek bank, causing large chunks of the bank to collapse. Using a 1/4-inch mesh screen, I sampled as much as I could of the blue clay from the collapsed areas. I also sampled several undercut areas that were in danger of imminent collapse. While most of the Paleo-Floral specimens I recovered consisted of sections of limbs and twigs and large pieces of tree bark, Over 100 small redwood and Douglas fir cones were recovered from the blue clay as well. All of the specimens are carbonized. A single cone of what appears to be California juniper was also found in the deposit. But what really excited me was the discovery of 6 pine cones. More about those later. A sample of the deposit measuring approximately 8 gallons in size was collected for flotation. I collected the sample in 2 5-gallon buckets, and it was processed by the archaeologist Bill Stillman. The resulting heavy fraction weighed 14.6 kilograms, or about 32 pounds. It was examined by Dr. Tom Wake of the Institute of Archaeology at UCLA. Dr. Wake reported that he found small pieces of carbonized wood, but no vertebrate fossils were observed in the sample. The light fraction has yet to be examined. A much smaller sample of the blue clay was collected as a soil sample for future analysis. This sample measured less than a half-gallon in size. It is yet to be analyzed. The riparian zone found along the upper Sonoma Creek watershed is today home to stands of coast redwood and Douglas fir. The discovery of fossil plant remains from these 2 species is not unusual. However, the discovery of the pine cones does appear to be significant. The only native pines found on upper Sonoma Creek today are the gray pines. The ancient cones I found in the blue clay deposit are from a different species. In 2017, Dosha Dodd of Sonoma State University joined me in the study of Sugarloaf's ancient pine cones. Dosha and I attempted to identify all 6 of the cones. As part of our research, we visited the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco in order to use their botanical collection for comparative purposes. We confirmed that the cones we felt to be Monterey pine were just that, but we still had questions about the others. In 2019, we presented our preliminary findings to the Milo Baker chapter of the California Native Plant Society in Santa Rosa. Several of the old pine cones are clearly Monterey pine. The cones of this species are distinctive and one of the easiest to recognize. They are asymmetrical with large, smooth, knob-like protuberances on the scales. The scales do not have sharp prickles like some pine species. The other cones found on Sonoma Creek are more difficult to identify. 1 or 2 of them appear to be possible hybrids, derived from a mingling of Monterey pine and some other species, possibly bishop pine or perhaps the knobcone pine. Hybrid KMX pines, a cross of knobcone and Monterey pines, have been reported in historic commercial forests, but are not known from the wild. Future efforts should be made to better identify the 6 pine cones. It's my hope that they will eventually be curated at the University of California Museum of Paleontology, alongside the museum's other Paleo-Floral specimens, including those I've recovered elsewhere. In 2005, I salvaged 33 cones from the fossil remains of a Sitka spruce tree I found eroding from the cliff at Bodega Head. Based on 2 radiocarbon dates I derived from the radiometric analysis of a nearby fossil wood specimen, the Sitka spruce tree is thought to have lived about 35,000 to 40,000 years ago. In 2014, 2 samples from the Paleo-Floral deposit on Sonoma Creek were submitted to Beta Analytics for radiometric analysis. Both of these samples were pieces of partially carbonized wood. One of the samples came from near the top of the blue clay deposit, the other from near its base. The upper sample dated to between 17,890 and 17,600 years ago. The lower sample dated to between 27,315 and 27,045 years ago. The 2 radiocarbon dates indicate that the deposit spans the period of approximately 27,000 to 18,000 years ago and falls within the Last Glacial Maximum. The Last Glacial Maximum occurred near the end of the last ice age, when the ice sheets had reached their maximum expansion, and as a result, the seas had dropped almost 400 feet below current mean sea level. In the northern hemisphere, the growth of the ice sheets began around 33,000 years ago, reaching their maximum coverage between 26,500 and 19,000 years ago, at which time the ice began to retreat and sea levels started to rise. The drop in sea levels during the last glacial maximum exposed vast tracts of the local coastal shelf, an area I've termed the Farallon Plain. The land was home to a bestiary of megafauna, including the Columbian mammoth, mastodon, ancient bison, horse, camel, saber-toothed cat, and short-faced bear. In recent years, Connie Millar, a paleoecologist with the U.S. Forest Service, has proposed a history of the Monterey pine based on climatic changes experienced during the Pleistocene. According to Millar's model, Monterey pine increased in abundance during the intermediate periods found between extreme cold and extreme warming events. Given that the 6 cones from Sonoma Creek appear to correlate more closely with the 27,000-year-old date I derived from the base of the deposit, they likely came from pine trees growing during the time of the Last Glacial Maximum. The non-pine Paleo-Floral specimens found higher up in the deposit, where I obtained the 18,000-year-old date, appear to associate with the end or early aftermath of the Last Glacial Maximum. This is where most, albeit not all, of the Douglas fir cones appear to have come from. A single juniper cone was recovered from near the base of the deposit and is indicative of a colder climate. Interestingly, in 2018, a 7th fossil pine cone, clearly Monterey pine, was found in Sonoma Creek about 100 meters upstream from the Paleo-Floral deposit. The cone was sitting on an exposed sandbar, and it was still waterlogged. It was apparent that the cone had recently eroded from the creek bank. I surveyed the immediate area, but was unable to find another exposure of Paleo-Floral deposit. The creek bank was less eroded and more vegetated in this area, making it harder to discern where the cone had originated. It shows, though, that either the Paleo-Floral deposit continues further up Sonoma Creek than first thought, or else there are additional deposits along the creek. There's another locus of blue clay immediately downstream from the main site, but I've seen no evidence of carbonized wood in it. Fossil pine cones dating to the late Pleistocene had been found in similar deposits on the Marin and Sonoma coast, but none had been reported from the interior until now, at least not as far as I'm aware. One inland example of a fossil Monterey pine cone is known from eastern Riverside County in Southern California, but that specimen dates to the Miocene epoch, meaning that it's so old that it's not relevant to this discussion. The 6 sugarloaf cones suggest that during the late glacial maximum, pine trees were found at least 60 miles inland from the coast. I used a figure of 60 miles since an additional 12 miles or so of currently submerged coastal shelf was exposed during the latest Pleistocene. As the Pleistocene epoch ended, the Monterey pine disappeared from the interior, its territory shrinking to what we know today. To see endemic stands of Monterey pine today, you have to visit the coast in the area of Ano Nuevo and Monterey. From there south, you will see natural stands of the tree. In other areas, the Monterey pines we see today have been planted as elements of landscaping. I believe the 6 pine cones I found on Sonoma Creek might have significance in a world that's now struggling with a changing climate. Future efforts to better date the 6 cones and to establish their genetic history are called for. Given that at least one of the cones shows clear evidence of ancient bark-boring beetle activity, that might prove another area for future study. Given increasing climate change and the ongoing drought we're experiencing in the American West, we now have over 100 million dead trees, characterizing California's embattled forest alone. Drought weakens the trees, and then the bark-boring beetles attack and finish them off. As the events of the last few years have shown, a forest of dead trees makes for much more destructive wildfires. The 6 pine cones and various other specimens of fossil wood I salvaged from upper Sonoma Creek may provide opportunity to study the effects of bark beetles in a late Pleistocene forest just before a time of global warming. The ancestral Monterey pines of Sonoma Creek were forced to migrate in order to survive. The Columbian mammoth and many other such species of Rancho La Brea megafauna were unable to find a suitable refuge, and as a result, they went extinct. Today, various plant and animal species are facing a similar decision and a similar fate: migrate or perish. In certain parts of the world, human communities are being forced to take flight as well. Other communities will undoubtedly be joining them in the coming years. In this way, people are like the trees in a climate-ravaged forest. I think it would be wise if we were to listen to the trees.